Welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I'm the host. Thank you so much for tuning in. Church Dropout is a podcast where we talk about all the reasons why people walk away from the American church and sometimes their faith, and offer hope to those who are re exploring faith from the margins. I had not planned on uploading another video or audio podcast this week, but I came across an article by that was written on the Gospel Coalition website, written by Trevin Wax, who is a very smart guy. In fact, I've grown from some of his writings in the past. Yeah, he's very bright, but he wrote an article entitled "Prone to Dechurch, Lord, I Feel It." And obviously, I think there is a play here on the hymn line that says "prone to wander, Lord, I feel it," right? And so I guess the sentiment is that there's a lot of people, when you look at the landscape of Christianity and culture in general, there's a lot of people who are thinking about leaving church, becoming a part of the de-churched community. And he's writing this article, I guess, to address this. Now, a couple things before we get into it, because what I want to do is I just want to walk through this article and kind of just talk through it and share some of my thoughts with you. But before we get into the article, there's just a couple things I want to mention here. Um, when an article like this pops up, I always wonder who's the audience of the article. Now, obviously, it was written on the Gospel Coalition website, so it was probably written to individuals who look to them for content, look to them for guidance in these areas and different things of that sort. But what the reason why I asked that question is because I feel like what they write a lot of times is so off. Like, I don't know who they're talking to. You know what I mean? Like, what individuals that are de-churched are you having this conversation with? Because what they argue to me, based upon my conversations and experiences, I feel like it's just way off. I feel like it's this avatar that they're building up, or this straw man that they're knocking down based upon, the straw man that they've built up, and I just don't know who the audience is. And if I'm a person who's de-churched, if I read this article, does this sway me back to the church? And in my opinion, it doesn't. I think it assumes a lot. It assumes the intent of the individual that is de-churched. It categorizes them or puts them in these rigid categories of individuals who are leaving for a very specific reason or experience very specific things. Not that they can get every reason right. I'm just saying, like, it doesn't really seem to address the core issues that I'm seeing as to why people are walking away from the church. And that leads to my second point. I just feel like there's a lot of talking past one another. I feel like in this whole conversation of people leaving the church or talking about the de-churched, I feel like there's a lot of conversation that's going, moving past one another, and nobody's talking to one another. And that could just be the state of the culture that we live in. We rather argue about things than to actually engage, these things. But it just feels like there's a lack of communication and speaking with individuals who are experiencing these things. And there's a couple other things that I'll bring out as I begin to read through this article. But those are just some preliminary thoughts. Again, what I want to do is kind of walk through the article, and as I'm walking through the article, just kind of comment here and there with, things that I recognize in this article, and then we will go from there. And as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. So just leave a comment below, keep the conversation moving forward, and we'll go from there. So, again, here's the article written October 31st: Prone to De-church, Lord, I Feel It. He starts by saying, a few weeks ago, a video clip made the rounds on social media of John Piper responding to a question about a believer who says, "I'm not walking away from Jesus, but I'm done with the church," after an experience of church hurt or failure in leadership. I'm not sure if you've seen this video. I had planned on doing something on this video, interestingly. But John Piper was asked a question. I believe this was old. I think this was actually in relationship or relation to um, Mark Driscoll, and when he, fell, or was fired by his church or walked away during the church discipline process. And John Piper was speaking in relation to individuals that were leaving the church as a result of being hurt by Driscoll and all of those events. And he flat out says, hey, listen, you can't say that you are following Jesus and not be a part of his church.
Go, Pastor John, I'm not walking away from Jesus, but I'm done with the church. Can't trust the leadership, held this guy in high esteem. So I'm not going to walk away from Jesus, but I'm done with the organized aspect of church.
Yeah. If you do that, you're walking away from Jesus. Yeah. Here's the reason. To say that I love Jesus, but I don't submit to his word is a lie. He who loves me will keep my words. Jesus founded the church. I didn't. Paul didn't. Jesus founded the church.
And this is the video that he's referring to. And he says, while not ruling out the choice of a believer to walk away from a particular congregation, Piper stressed the impossibility of thinking someone could follow Christ and leave the church altogether. To walk away from Christ is to walk away from, to walk away from the church is to walk away from Christ, he said. Now, that's true, depending on how you define the church. And I really feel like this is at the heart of this argument. You know, it depends on how you define the church. A lot of times when we speak of church, especially in Western culture, we tend to use church synonymous with big C, church, like they're the same word, right? So what ends up happening is when we're talking about the church, you got to figure out what we're actually talking about. Are we talking about the gathering of the people together that we call church, or are we talking about those whom Christ died for, past, present, future, eternity, all that type stuff, heaven, earth? Are we talking about the body of Christ? Because depending on how you define that is going to, in some senses, tell you whether or not this statement is true, right? And I don't think, and this is where I think this gets really messy. And I know why John Piper and others make this argument. They have a very high regard for the local fellowship, but it's just interesting to me that they kind of ignore the play on words here when it comes to church. I don't think anyone, well, not even think, no one would assume that they could walk away from the church and still be in fellowship with Christ, right? They cannot walk away from the body of believers that Christ has given his life for and still say that they're a part of Christ, because to deny that community is to deny Christ. He not only saved us as individuals, but he saved us into a collective community. So nobody would disagree with that or argue that, right? But when we talk about whether or not a person can walk away from the church, from the local gathering or a particular expression of a local gathering and still follow Christ, I personally think a person can. Now, is it wise? Is it going to affect their walk? Is it going to limit their ability to grow? Right? Yeah, those are all things that we'd have to answer. And we'll talk about that a little bit because some things are brought up here. But I think this all depends on how you define church. Right? The article goes on to say that this statement was controversial, says something about our contemporary individualistic context. And see, this is kind of the issue to me, is that I feel like, again, here we're making some assumptions about the people who think this way, that they're very individualistic, right? And that could be true. There are some people who are, caving into culture, contemporary culture, and they're individualistic, right? That could be true. But how come it can't be a both and statement? How come this can't also tell us about the state of the modern church? Why can't the fact that people think this way tell us something about the state of the church, the condition of the modern church? Why does it have to only speak to what's happening with the individuals who are choosing to be dechurched or choosing to walk away from the church. It could also speak to what's happening within the culture of church. He goes on to say, it's true, we've experienced a season of rot and corruption being exposed in a number of high profile churches. So it's not surprising that some might conclude a personal relationship with Jesus is what matters the most. The exclusion, to the exclusion of organized Christianity in all its messiness, right? So again, he acknowledges the fact that the church has had some missteps. In his words, he says there's been some rot and corruption with high profile churches, as if everyone who's leaving the church is leaving because of these high profile churches having rot and corruption in them. There are other reasons why people are walking away from the church. And some of those reasons are because of the church, not just because um there's problems with the church leadership and all of that stuff. That's true. Some people are leaving the American church or the form of or the expression of the American church because of those things, but some people are leaving for other reasons as well. And to conclude that this is because they value their personal relationship with Jesus, that they say that that matters the most, matters more than the communal aspect of Christianity, I think again is amiss. Everybody who's walking away from church is not walking away to be alone. They're not walking away and saying, "Hey, I have a relationship with Jesus, and Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, and it's not really connected to any other individual, and I can walk this out alone." That's not, again, a majority of the people and a majority of the conversations that I've had and a majority of um, people I've seen talk about this. A lot of it hasn't had to do with that. It hasn't had to do with people misunderstanding that we are not saved. We're not just saved to Christ. We're saved to one another. Right. And then he goes on to say in a survey from a decade ago, a minority of self identifying Christians claimed the church was essential to one's faith. So it's almost like he's saying, listen, something has changed in the mindset of people because at one time people were saying that the church is essential to one's faith. And I don't think a lot of people who are walking away from the church are saying that the church is not essential to their faith. I don't think that they're saying that. I think they're walking away to some degree because the church is essential to their faith. And the expression of church that they're involved with or the church that they're involved with is a hindrance to their faith, right? But to say people that are walking away from church are saying, and are saying that, hey, we're not going to be a part of it, are claiming that the church is not essential to one's faith, I think again is a reach. And furthermore, and again, we'll probably talk about this more, but man, it just ignores one of the big issues to me with this whole article is it puts all of the responsibility on the person rather than the church. And the church does this quite often. We victim blame, right? All of the responsibility to maintain fellowship, to reconcile, to put up with, to stick with, all of that is on the people. It's on the persons who've experienced the trauma and the hurt and who experienced whatever it is that they've experienced. It's like, hey, the church is essential. Yes, the church is messy, but you have an obligation to the church as if the church has no obligation to them. It seems as though we should be rebuking ourselves as the church and saying, listen, we've jacked up here because part of the reason why the culture feels the way it feels about the current church is because we have failed to function as the community of love that Christ has died for, which has caused some people to say, I don't need to be a part of that. Right. But let me get back to the article because we'll probably talk about that more. the church's mother. But if you zoom out of the contemporary Western setting, you find that Piper's comments about following Jesus and belonging to the church are standard fare for nearly all Christians around the world today, as has been the case for nearly all of church history. Cyprian, I believe, or Cyprian of Carthage is one whom said, "You cannot have God as your father unless you have the church as your mother," a statement reiterated by the reformers, including John Calvin, who pointed to the motherly terminology as a sign of how useful, indeed how necessary, the church is for believers. You know, one of the things that's very interesting about this is that Protestants will use Catholics when it's convenient. You know what I mean? Like when they agree with us, it's all good. You know what I mean? But when they don't, it's not. And I'm almost positive that Cyprian was a Catholic, and you can tell also by the terminology. The church is the Holy Mother, God, and so again, nobody's denying this. Nobody's denying that I know of that belonging to the church is standard for all Christians, that they should belong to a church. But here's the problem. Here's another thing that I think needs to be defined is what is the call for believers as it relates to our relationship with other believers? What is it that we are called not to forsake? What is it that we are called to be a part of? He goes on to say that John Calvin says, right? John Calvin says, and I'm going to repeat it again. He says the motherly terminology, pointing to the motherly terminology as a sign of how useful, indeed how necessary the church is for believers. Listen, it is very necessary for believers to be in fellowship with other believers. And I would even say for the local gathering, in the expression that we predominantly use today, that it is very important for believers to be a part of that. It is beneficial for them. It is very necessary for their growth. But it still doesn't mean ignore why people are choosing the opposite. And it doesn't holistically speak to whether or not people are in fellowship when they leave the church. See, and this is where this article, hey, listen, is the only way that we can fulfill the call to be in relationship with other believers is the only way to fulfill that. The only way to fulfill that is it only by being a part of a local expression of church. He goes on to say we could even go back even further to the New Testament itself to see the connection between following Christ and belonging to his people. Okay, listen, this is so interesting to me, right? Yeah, this is true. We can go back in the New Testament to see the connection between following Christ and belonging to his people. Again, how are we defining church? Because if someone is saying that they're not going to be in fellowship with other believers, that's a problem. But if people are saying, I'm not going to be a part of the organized church, I'm not going to be a part of this expression of one's faith. I mean, this part of this expression of church, then that's not a problem. Now we ought to check the motives. We ought to see why that is. But again, we're making the church synonymous with belonging to God's people. The church is the body of Christ. Yeah, the universal church. The believers, past, present, future, heaven, and earth, are the body of Christ, not the local gathering. That's an expression of the body of Christ. Listen, when the body's not in the building, it's just a building. It's only when the people show up there that makes it church because the church is there. So I'm going to start again. We can go back even further to the New Testament itself to see the connection between following Christ and belonging to his people. The church is the body of Christ, listing out. And again, it's talking about the people of God collectively together, impossible to cling to the head of Christ without doing the same to his body. Who wouldn't agree with that? It is impossible to accept Christ and not accept his body. But when you make the church the local expression of church, his body, that to me is where we have a problem. Now, listen, let me just interject this because I know it's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I do hold the local expression of the church in high regard. But I'm also not naive to the fact that the local expression has been a hindrance for some people in their worship of God. And people are walking away because of those hindrances, whether it's church hurt or anything else. The apostolic letters assume the first Christians were committed to each other in covenantal fellowship. And since the author of Hebrews commands believers to gather, it's a contradiction to claim to follow Jesus and yet disregard the apostolic instruction. See, and I agree with all of this. And you notice how they're not saying church. The author of Hebrews commands believers to gather. Yes, to come together. But we're reading in our expression of church into this passage, or he's reading into this passage his expression of gathering, church. The first Christians were committed to each other in covenantal fellowship. That is the call of God, that we are in covenantal fellowship with one another. How that is done is going to vary. It's not going to look the same. How that's done is going to change. It's not going to look the same. Some are going to gather in a house. Some are going to gather in a large building, right? Some are going to gather in prison. It's not going to look the same. There's not going to be the same. The elements are not going to be expressed the same way. It's just not going to be the same. Now, there's things that I'm still working through as far as that, because there's cultural things, and I'm talking about church cultural things that I'm so used to having as a part of the gathering. But the reality is that church is in various forms and expressions. And because someone is saying that they're leaving an expression of church, or they're leaving the gathering of church Sunday mornings the way we know it, does not mean that they're leaving Christ. And I'm going to do a video on misconceptions or myths about people who leave the church. He goes on to say an unchurched Christian, right? So here's a Christian who's outside of fellowship of the church. Now, here by church, the unchurched are individuals who are no longer attending a Sunday worship service. That's what he has in mind here. I would go out on a limb to bet that this is what he has in his mind here. An unchurched Christian, in other words, a Christian who does not go to church on Sundays or go to any expression of church on Sunday, as John Stott pointed out, is a grotesque anomaly. It is abnormal, is grossly abnormal. The New Testament knows nothing of a such person. And I would say that that's true. The New Testament does not know any instance of an individual who is saying they're in fellowship with Christ but not have fellowship with God's people. I agree with that, if that's what he's describing here. But it sounds like what he's saying is that to say that a person is no longer going to church on Sunday, that is a grotesque anomaly, and that the New Testament knows of no such person that's going to forsake gathering with the church and say they're done with it. But my thing is what are people saying they're done with? What is it that people are saying that they're done with? When people say that they are leaving the church, that they're done with church, what are they saying? And it's my contention that most people, not all people, some people are saying that. And I would say that those people need to be checked. But most people are saying that they're done with this American expression, this American form of church that really, okay, that's what they're saying. I'm not going to get into all of that, but that's what they're saying. They're not saying that they're done with fellowship with other believers. They're not saying that they're denying any type of communion with the body. They're walking away from an expression. They're walking away from an expression. Disappearing agency in dechurching. The recent oh, the recent dust up over Piper's comments on walking away from the church has helped crystallize some thoughts I've entertained for a couple years now, an aspect of discourse in dechurching that bothers me. I discussed it briefly on an episode of Reconstructing Faith with Megan Hill. In the way we talk about dechurching, it seems like personal agency disappears. We talk as if dechurching is a phenomenon that just happens, much like a snowstorm or a hurricane blowing through, or a hurricane blowing and leaving the landscape changed. The reality is, dechurching is a result of personal choices extended over time. Dechurching doesn't happen to someone, as if people were passive spectators. Leaving the church is something people do. Agreed. Agreed. But what's not being said here is why. Why are people thinking about leaving the church? They're not doing it in a vacuum. They're not doing it without thought. They're making a conscious decision to walk away long before people act with their feet. They entertained it in their mind. That's just the last step. The courage to walk away is the last step. People have been thinking about that for a long time. But the question is why? What's going on with the church? Why would someone who's deeply connected with the church, embedded in relationships with people at the church, why would they turn and say, I'm leaving, I'm done? Could it be that their relationship was so deep and their relationship was so formed by that community that whatever happened, that break actually broke them and they're grieving it? We're acting as if people have not returned either. But the reality is that we agree with that. Like, nobody's saying that this is in a vacuum. And this is what I mean when I read articles like this. It's like, who are they talking about? Like, who said that? Who says that dechurching is something that happens to people? It's the result of something that happens to people a lot of times. Can't be all the time. Some people are leaving for selfish reasons. Agreed. But I'm not sure who's saying that, because anybody who's left the church would agree with that. The statistics in the great dechurching demonstrate that the decision to leave the church for many isn't always conscious. For a good number of people who've dropped out of the church, the process is like a slow leak in a tire, a drifting away due to a change in life, circumstances, inconvenient schedules, and superficial relationships. Now, see, this is the type of stuff that makes me upset. The process is like a slow leak in the tire. You see what I'm saying? Like, when you have a slow leak in the tire, you know what I mean? Matter of fact, I got one on my truck, right? I got a slow leak right now and I keep putting air in the tire. It's just a slow leak and I'm not fixing it. Again, the responsibility is on me, right? I'm not fixing it. I'm not doing anything about it. I'm just allowing it to be a slow leak until something changes. Right. And he says a drifting away due to a change in life. So again, again, these are all in my opinion, these are all superficial reasons why people leave church. That there was a change in life circumstances. You know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe a crisis happened and church was the first thing to go. But I would still say, as a former pastor, but having a pastor's heart, that I'm going to lean into that, because people's actions aren't always their desire. Right. But then he also goes on to say inconvenient schedules. See, so people are walking away from the church and they're becoming dechurched because, the church doesn't fit their schedule. And then he says superficial relationships. There may never be a conscious choice to walk away. Oh, maybe I misunderstand that. But anyway, there may never be a conscious choice to walk away. So I guess what he's saying here, let me back up so I don't strawman him. So I guess what he's saying here is that the statistics are showing that, people are leaving the way people are leaving the church isn't always conscious. Like, people are just fading away. And that's true, and that's true. I would agree with that. But everything that I did just say stands, but I would agree with that as well. That their decision may not be a conscious choice to walk away. It just may be something that they're not nurturing, that walks them down that path. And for those people, I would say that that's an issue. Yes, I would agree with that. But for most people who have walked away from the church, it has been a conscious decision. At least the people that I'm talking about, the people who are deeply who have been impacted deeply by whatever it is and has caused them to have to make a decision, a big change in their life that would disrupt everything that they've known up until that point. He goes on to say, still, dechurching requires decisions. We choose to invest in we choose to invest our time in something other than our local congregation. We put off the decision to join a local church when we move to a new town. We prioritize other activities over worship and other believers. We leave a fellowship if we experience hurt and distress, and we choose not to look for another church where spiritual healing might be found. See, again, going back, this just feels like, again, people leave church for frivolous reasons, and it's dangerous because they never end up going back because it gets easy to do life without a church. Now, let me be very personal here. I went through a period of deconstruction, still kind of walking through some of that, but I went through a period of deep deconstruction. And my deconstruction was not necessarily my faith, it was more of the church. Things that I was experiencing, things that I had experienced, all types of stuff. I'll get into that story some other time. But the reality is there was a long period of time where I wasn't going to church. And let me say this, I was still in deep fellowship with other Christians. I was in fellowship with other believers. Okay. So it wasn't like I was walking alone. So I was getting relationship. I was in relationship. There was accountability. There was love. There was communion. There was those things that were happening. They were just happening outside of a local church context. But the reason why I'm bringing that up is that every day I would think about, wrestle through how to be in communion with the greater body as I was working through these things as it relates to the church. So I wasn't the individual who was, prioritizing activities over worship. I felt deeply, and again, here's something that I never really said out loud till just now, but I felt deeply convicted. But you know what? You know what? I don't know if I was feeling convicted because I was doing something that I felt was wrong or against God, or the culture of church is so embedded in me that I felt like I needed to be somewhere on Sunday that represented being in community with others. That somehow, because I'm not at church, I'm not fellowshipping with God or with others. But nevertheless, I just think that when we say things this way, it categorizes everyone who feels a certain way into this box, and it misses. It really closes the door from the Gospel Coalition and individuals like this, or I don't want to say the Gospel Coalition, or Trevin Wax, or individuals who may agree with this. It closes the door for them from having conversations with people, because what ends up happening is people read this and they assume this on the people that they're talking to, and that's not the case. And this last sentence here says, "We choose not to look for another church where spiritual healing might be found." Earlier, I said that the church has a habit of placing all of the responsibility on the victim, right? So imagine a woman who is being abused by her husband, and we treat her the way we say treat the church. So somebody who's been deeply wounded or traumatized by, maybe some churches would do this, but anyway, if somebody's been deeply traumatized by their husband, physically or emotionally, whatever that is, and they say, "Hey, this is what's happening in my marriage." Imagine if they said, "Hey, we understand that it's messy. He's not perfect. You know, work it out." Right? And then let's just say they can't work it out. Let's just say the person can't work it out with that person and they choose to leave that relationship. And then when they leave that relationship, they go and they say, "Hey, listen," we say to them like, "Well, hey, go find another relationship because there may be healing in that relationship for you." We're not really addressing the problem. The problem is that this is a person who's been victimized by that individual. And what's going to make that healthy is not just joining another church where healing might be. A part of making that correct is addressing the issues that actually moved them to that point. And I feel like this is where we're ignoring the responsibility of the church to lean into the suffering of people who feel like they do not have connection in the church, in the modern church today. Dechurching doesn't just happen. Oh, did I read that already? Okay, yeah. Dechurching doesn't just happen as if we have no moral agency, right? So again, I don't know who's saying they left the church, but they didn't make a choice to leave it. Thinking you could pursue the Christian life on your own apart from the local body of believers isn't only wrong-headed, it's wrong. Agreed. It's disobedience to the King Jesus. Agreed. By removing the moral frame of dechurching, we do a disservice to believers who need to be wooed back into the community. Okay. Agreed, I guess. Moral problem of churchlessness. I can hear the howls of Protestants already, as if insisting on church membership is just another way to minimize, justify, or excuse abominable behavior for some who claim the name of Christ. Let's be clear about the rot in the church. God will not be mocked. He will deal justly with the bad shepherds who misuse his name and commit atrocities and prey on his precious flock. No sin against his people goes unnoticed. Agreed. So we have to wait until God redeems the church or judges the church in order for the church to change. I sympathize with those whose experience in the church has left them spiritually battered and bruised. Right. And to say that and to turn around and say, and I don't know what he's going to say, but I'm assuming, but to turn around and say that doesn't give you an excuse not to be in fellowship, to me, is to minimize the impact of that hurt. It's minimizing it. It's like me giving my son he's 7, giving him 100 pounds of weight and telling him to lift it. And then telling him, listen, son, it's not that heavy. It's not that bad. To him, it is. It's his experience. To him, it is. But most of today's dechurching is the result of wayward hearts, not church leader scandals. I would assume that some of that is, but let's not put everybody in the same box. The human heart tends towards sin, and when we walk down the disobedient path, we are inclined to rationalize our direction and decisions. True. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, the old hymn goes. Most of us haven't borne the brunt of church scandals, at least not personal, which means as if we rely on the stories and reasons of church stories as the reasons of our churchlessness. See, again, the only reason why people are not leaving church, or the only reason why people are leaving the church is not just the fact that church leaders have failed. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. Like, this is where I'm going to give some reasons why I believe people are leaving the church. It's likely we are searching for the slightest justification to do what we wanted to do in the first place. Why is there always, and again, and I just feel like this is typical Reformed theology. And I hesitate on saying this, but there's always an emphasis on the negative. There's always an emphasis on, the negative. You know what I mean? It's likely we're searching for the slightest justification to do what we wanted to do in the first place. Maybe people are actually legitimately walking away from the church because they are actually traumatized and hurt. Maybe they're walking away from the church because the church has been a hindrance to their faith. That the form and the expression of church in every context, not just the word faith movement, but the expression of the American church has not really glorified Jesus. It's glorified itself. Which is an argument that could be made about this article, that this is the church being for the church when the church is supposed to be for the people. Road to Unbelief. Matthew Lee Anderson points to the letter of J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote to his son who had written to him about his sagging faith. Tolkien acknowledged the church's sins and failures and how corruption might weaken the believer's devotion. But he warned against the temptation to find church scandals as a convenient opportunity to turn away from one's own fault to find a scapegoat. Greed. Listen, okay, so when I was going through what I was going through, one of my friends would challenge me deeply. He's like, Alan, you need to be somewhere. Like, he would challenge me deeply. And I would tell him, and we would walk through it and all of that type stuff. But he was challenging. He was making sure that it wasn't just me not wanting to be in fellowship. I remained close. Leaning on the work of historian Philip Jenkins, who claimed it wasn't the church's transgressions that sped up secularism, but a rapid secularization that looks for more church scandals. In a society where piety prevails, the incentive to cloak the church's transgressions is considerable, which is perfectly compatible with widespread expectation that the church will be terrible, since a pious society will know its church history and read its Bible. By contrast, a secularizing society will look for justification for its growing unbelief and find them in the repugnant and wicked conduct of Christians. Right? So people look for reasons not to believe. Some people look for reasons not to go to church. Agreed. But is that what's happening? And that's where I push back. I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think holistically the people who are walking away from church are walking away because they don't want to be a part of the church, are walking away because they want to forsake fellowship, or they see their faith as individualistic. I think there are other reasons, legitimate reasons, as to why people are walking away from the church, and the church needs to address those reasons. We think people are leaving the church today because of all the church scandals, but it's possible we hear more about church scandals today because people seek to justify their decision to leave. Why is the New Testament so insistent on gathering with believers in covenant fellowship? See, the terminology here is just so interesting. The Bible doesn't say, the Bible implies that believers should be in covenant fellowship, and that covenant is based upon Jesus Christ, not covenant fellowship as in membership. See, and this is where again these words have meanings, and what do they mean by them? Perhaps it's one way we are inoculated against the Docetist heresy. Docetist heresy that Christ only appeared to have a body when he was actually just when he was actually just a spirit being. C. Fitzsimmons Allison writes, I'm religious, but I don't believe in institutional Christianity. Is often a docetic way, is also a docetic way to say, I want to be spiritual without any ambiguities, frustrations, or responsibilities that embody spiritual commitment. I want to be a parent, but I don't want to change a diaper. I want to be on the soccer team, but I want to do my own thing over the corner, show up for practice whenever I feel like it, and do whatever I please. Institutions are embodiments and substantiations of ideals, aims, and values. Docetism is a special abdication of responsibility to incarnate ideals, values, or love. It is altogether too easy to love and care in the abstract. Concrete situations of diapers, debts, divorce, and listening to and being with someone in depression and despair is the test of real love. Docetism is the religious way to escape having love tested in the flesh. All of us are tempted to audit life rather than participate fully and be tested by it. All of us are tempted to audit life rather than participate fully and be tested by it. The Christian needs the church. No, the Christian needs intimate fellowship with other believers, which is expressed in the church. Working on our salvation with fear and trembling is a corporate exercise. Paul's instruction is plural, not an individualistic pursuit. Amen. We must not lose sight of worship the most important thing we do, our duty and our joy. Boy, I'm jacking reading up today. But anyway, To gather and to celebrate the risen Lord on the morning of the first day of each week is to say something about the nature of the universe, to align our hearts with wonder in the heart of the world, to give testimony to the still glimmering truth of King Jesus crucified and raised. This is going to sound bad, but again, do we need this form or expression of church to do that? Is this the only way that this is possible? Jesus remains committed to us, no matter our sins, our many sins. Perhaps it is our call to match today's church scandals with the scandalously determined commitment to Christ's people. I think I said a lot here. I don't want to reiterate the things that I did say. I certainly understand the care and the concern for individuals who are dechurched. And I definitely believe that there are individuals who are not in church that are outside the church for the wrong reasons, that they're doing it for selfish, reasons that, they don't really have any other reason to be out of fellowship other than maybe they want to do something else with their Sundays. But we got to be careful to not put everybody in the same basket, to assume that the reasons why all Christians or individuals are walking away from the American church is for this purpose. Some people are walking away for legitimate reasons, and some people's wounds are very deep. The situations that they may have faced has traumatized them. The same way we wouldn't tell someone to walk back into an abusive relationship just because they're imperfect and because it would be glorious to God. We wouldn't tell them that. Well, maybe we would. I wouldn't. But the reality is that, listen, in order for a person to healthily experience the church, to healthily experience real deep fellowship with other believers, they themselves have to have a healthy understanding of the church. And the church itself must be healthy. We're making the assumption that, well, actually, we're not making the assumption. We're admitting that the church is imperfect, but we're asking people to, it's all good. The church is imperfect. We know it's imperfect. So stick with it. Listen, I don't feel like all cases means that people need to leave church. I think again there are legitimate reasons why people should walk away from a church, and some people need to stay. However, when we write articles like this that kind of put everyone in the same basket, I think is dangerous. So that's it. That's all I have. Like I said, I will do a video on the myths or misconceptions as to why people walk away from church, and maybe even put it on the offensive. Why people walk away from the church, to give some context here or some balance to what I think people are experiencing, and maybe help the church to see that everyone is not the same. And some people are searching for Jesus, and it's not just disobedience or a lack of desire to be a part of a formal community. So that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in to this podcast and watching. I know that was a little bit long, but it is what it is. If you don't mind, please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this at. I'd appreciate it. Keep the conversation going by commenting below, and we'll talk soon. God bless.